the subject of grounds, the ground scheme for our little cars has come up again in the DeLorean Facebook groups. And there seems to be a little misunderstanding still about what exactly is going on with our cars and how they are grounded. The negative side of all the circuits. Unlike a traditional car, see, a traditional car, the car body is made out of metal, so it is electrically conductive. So what the car companies will do is use the entire car body as a massive ground plane. And the negative side of whatever circuit you're dealing with is typically just attached to the nearest access point for the car body. Or something like the dashboard superstructure, which is also made out of metal on a traditional car. So, things like dash gauges and the radio, and courtesy lights, and whatever they need to ground, they just find a access point that'll be convenient during the assembly process and just drill a hole and stick a sheet metal screw in it. And that's how they are typically grounded. Well, obviously that won't work on our cars because our car bodies are made out of fiberglass, which is not conductive. So in its absence, what they did was they ran a series of jumper wires. This is one of the factory jumper locations, junctions. Disregard the battery cable. That there is what it looks like from the factory. Looks just like this. The wires are soldered together and then they put a heat shrink cap on the soldered together junction. And out of each junction, one wire will make its way to that bolt right there. Okay, that's what this terminal is right here. This terminal is all the junctions elsewhere in the car making their way to this bolt. And so that bolt is critically important because it grounds virtually the entire vehicle. With the exception of items that are grounded to the engine block itself, and a couple of items that are grounded to the radiator support bolt. Every other circuit on the car passes through that bolt, including the fuel pump. That's where your fuel pump is grounded, is through that bolt right there. The inertia switch is grounded to a junction behind the central HVAC plenum, and then one wire runs from that junction back to this bolt. That's where your instrument cluster is grounded. It's where all your electronics are grounded. Everything in the ECU compartment, everything in the relay compartment. Virtually the entire vehicle passes through that one bolt right there. And from the factory, that's not a brass bolt. From the factory, that bolt is made out of steel. So it can rust. Also, that bolt is 6 millimeters from the factory. You see mine is 8 millimeters or 5/16, you know, one and the same. But from the factory, that's a 6 millimeter bolt. But this terminal here, the eye on this terminal is 8 millimeters or 5/16, one and the same. So that terminal fits kind of woggly on the factory bolt. So if you take the factory steel 6 millimeter bolt out, what you'll find is a D-shaped hole. Okay, it's not a circular hole, it's D-shaped. It's identical to the hole for the stud that holds the positives, all the brown wires that feed the positive side of the car underneath the bulkhead connectors. And it's also identical to the D-shaped hole for the jump start post. Which leads me to believe that the original intent was to put a stud in that hole, not a bolt. It would have been identical to the positive stud underneath the bulkhead connectors. But for whatever reason, they decided to put a bolt in instead. So I rounded my hole out. You know, I filed off the flat side of the D-shaped hole, made it circular, and then I put a 8 millimeter bolt, 5/16 bolt, in the hole. And my bolt is made out of brass, so it cannot rust. Every critical electrical connection on my car is made out of brass. Just like that's part of my ground bus right there, and you can see it's a brass bolt. I'm a total brass snob when it comes to electricity. So, on my car, that bolt has been rendered a little bit redundant because I have a supplemental ground bus. But if I didn't have a supplemental ground bus, I would have a rust-proof, properly sized bolt carrying my negatives to eventually the battery. This is the other side of that bolt that I was just showing you. My fingertip is on the head of that bolt. So this is where that bolt passes through the rear bulkhead, and then this wire here, this black wire right here, is carrying all the car body grounds to this bolt right here, which then attaches all the grounds to the frame, and then they pass through the frame to the negative battery cable, which is attached by the trailing arm bracket. Now, once again, from the factory, that bolt is steel, and the washer is steel. It's a steel bolt and a steel washer, so they can get rusty, especially being weather exposed here. Mine is brass. But they are at least the proper size. From the factory, that's an 8 millimeter bolt, and that's an 8 millimeter ring terminal. So that is the other point that you need to make sure is not rusty and is still tight. Make sure that the nut and the bolt are still tight. And also, you'll notice that my washer fits the recess. There's a little recess in the frame where they would chip the epoxy off of the frame to expose bare metal. Well, from the factory, the washer is too small to fully fill that recess. I used a washer that is exactly the same size as that recess, so mine is, totally filled with the brass washer. once again, it's a little bit of a moot point because I, of course, run a ground bus. So I have a supplemental ground scheme. But even in its absence, I would have a reliable, rust-proof, properly sized fastener and washer carrying the ground plane through the frame to the negative battery cable.